I think, first of all, let's talk about where you are because we can't tell from looking at this, but you are very, very far from the United States right now, correct?
Yes, we are off the coast of the South Island of New Zealand aboard the U.S. icebreaker Nathaniel B. Palmer. So this is a National Science Foundation sponsored vessel, and we're going on a research expedition to East Antarctica.
Okay, so why Antarctica?
So we are here. We're a team of benthic ecologists. So we all study animals, tiny animals that live in ocean mud. I study roundworms called nematodes, but we have people that study sea stars and sea urchins and sea cucumbers and other types of worms. So we're all really excited about squishy, gooey animals that no one really thinks about. And Antarctica is just one of these really remote regions that no one ever goes to. So we are trying to find new species around Antarctica. We're trying to understand biodiversity. So how many species are there? And Antarctica in general, we think of it like a polar rainforest. So Antarctica as a continent has been cut off from the rest of the ocean for 30 million years. And there's a lot of endemic species that don't exist anywhere else, like think Madagascar or Australia. And we're on an expedition to basically find and discover new species down here.
So tell me a little bit about the ocean currents around Antarctica and what makes them different from everywhere else.
Yeah, so Antarctica, so we think of Antarctica like this, if you make a fist with your thumb out. So this is the continent of Antarctica, and the ocean current around Antarctica is a kind of it's called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, but it's this swirling vortex that goes entirely around the continent like this. And so, unlike other areas of the ocean, that ocean current effectively cuts off Antarctica from other parts of the ocean. So it's a barrier for species to travel down to Antarctica, but it's also really important from a weather perspective because the force of that current and the kind of relentlessness of it, it creates a lot of important weather patterns worldwide.
Interesting. So how does it impact weather? If it's the ocean, how does it impact the sky?
So the most important reason why Antarctica impacts the weather is because Antarctica is the place on Earth where the water in the ocean at the surface gets very salty and dense and it sinks to the bottom. So in addition to that swirling current, we have a lot of sea ice formation. So when sea ice forms, it leaves behind very cold, very salty, very dense water after the ice forms. And that sinks to the bottom of the ocean and basically travels around the world in this process called thermohaline circulation, but referred to as the ocean conveyor belt. And so this is essentially what drives the circulation of all the major ocean currents worldwide, both in the deep sea and in the surface waters.
So it's interesting. How big is this current and how long would it take, say, like if you were to drop something in the current right there, how long would it take to go around the globe?
It would take about, if you're following one particle of water, it would take 1,000 years for it to sink in the Antarctic surface waters and then travel all the way around through the deep sea. And then eventually, after 1,000 years, that molecule of water would come back to the surface in the North Pacific. And yeah, so it's a very long process.
So what are you hoping to learn? What are you excited about?
We are excited about going to East Antarctica because this is the first time that the US Antarctic program has been to East Antarctica in 22 years. So this is a pretty momentous occasion just from a science perspective because US research teams never get down here. We're always mostly on the other side of Antarctica, the Western Antarctic Peninsula. And so it's just a very remote region, just very unexplored. And so we don't know what we're going to find. And that's really exciting, but we definitely know we're going to find a lot of new species down here.
Okay, so how are you going to do it? Tell me about the tools you use, and you just jump in the water and grab samples, or how does it work?
No, we're not actually allowed in the water. So if someone's in the water, that's a pretty big problem. So we all stay on the boat. We use a bunch of different types of sampling equipment. My team uses sediment cores. So think of like the PVC pipes in your house that you use for plumbing. We send down those tubes to the bottom to the seafloor, and then we push them in, and then they get blocked off and then brought back up to the surface. And I study microscopic worms called nematodes, roundworms. And so there are thousands of those worms that are microscopic living in the sediment. So we'll bring that back. We'll typically put stuff in the freezer and bring it back to the labs because we do DNA sequencing and genomics. So we'll bring it back to the labs at the University of Georgia, and we will do PCR and DNA sequencing to basically try to discover those new species. And in addition to that, we'll also put the little worms under the microscope.
Wow. So if you're going to the seafloor, can you learn about past weather that's happened in Antarctica and maybe what the climate looked like a long, long time ago there?
Yeah, you definitely can. We aren't doing that on this research expedition, but I have collaborators and I know other scientists that work with that. So that would be paleoclimate studies. So you can actually tell a lot about the past weather in Antarctica through the species that are preserved in the mud. So they're called microfossils. So little phytoplankton and diatoms, they leave behind a kind of microscopic shells, like microscopic seashells essentially. And based on the species that are there, we can correlate that with past climate records. So usually they will cross-reference the actual record, the history of the species with the ice cores. So usually paleoclimate studies will look at gases trapped in ice, or they'll look at the actual types of sand grains in addition to the species. And they use all that information combined to reconstruct the past climate of Antarctica and also tell when there's ice versus when there's not ice. So the species that are preserved in the mud is very different under the ice versus when the ocean is open without any ice cover on top.
What's the weather like in Antarctica this time of year? How are you guys going to be dressing? How do you prepare for this?
That's a good question. So I have not actually ever been to Antarctica before. This is my first time down there. So I think I have like a whole suitcase full of like fleece and hats and gloves and everything. So I mean, I think I've been preparing like I'm going on just a really cold ski trip. So lots of base layers, lots of like, jackets with neck warmth and down everything. So yeah, lots of base layers, lots of layers. So if you get hot, you can peel off your jacket, but if you get cold, you can just kind of layer up. So I really think of it like a really intensive ski trip with a lot of moving around.
And a lot of learning. All right, so give me a little bit of background on you and how you became interested in becoming a biologist, where you went to school and where you are now, the whole history.
So I grew up in Massachusetts, and when I was a kid in school, I mean, we'd hear a lot about Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. So I spent a lot of time going down to Cape Cod, to the beach down there, and going to the Museum of Science in Boston. And they did a lot of ship-to-shore outreach programs. So they would broadcast, just like me, they would broadcast to the museum and all the school groups and the kids that are there. So I remember very vividly having that experience, and I always loved the idea of being an explorer. And I just always really loved the ocean. So I thought, why don't I combine that into with my love of science and study the ocean. And I don't know, I've always been not a big fan of cute and cuddly things. I'm much more like into gooey invertebrates like jellyfish and squishy things. And so eventually that meant I ended up doing a PhD on worms because they are just understudied and no one thinks about them. But from a research perspective, they're actually really exciting and they can help us answer a lot of big questions in ecology and evolutionary biology and deep sea biodiversity, things like that.
So a lot of your background is biology. You are a biologist, but there's so much crossover here with like the physical oceanography aspect, right? It seems like you're learning so much about the physical aspects of the ocean, even with that. Like you're starting so small and then learning about these big things.
Yeah, exactly. So nowadays, science is really interdisciplinary. So even though I am a biologist by training, I will actually work a lot with computer scientists and data scientists and physical oceanographers and chemical oceanographers. And it's really important to understand the context of where you're getting samples from and where you're finding species. So when we're trying to discover new species, we actually think a lot about things like depth, how the water masses influence the species that are living there, how the transport of food happens. So things fall from the deep sea, but also you have organic matter in the sediments. So it's really important from a science perspective to understand different disciplines and understand how those different factors, including physical oceanography, influence that environment that your species are living in.
Very cool. Well, we're excited to hear about everything that you're going to learn. How long are you there? When do you come back to dry land?
We should be coming back to dry land on May 11th. That's our current end date for this cruise. So it's yeah, 2-month ocean expedition down to Antarctica without internet for most of that time. So we're just going to this really remote place. And from New Zealand, it takes 7 days of transit. So driving the ship at full speed, it will still take 7 days for us to get from port in New Zealand to our first sample site on the Antarctic continental shelf. So it's a really remote region of the Earth. And that's why we have to spend so long down there, because it's a lot of travel time to get down there.
Yeah, I guess you're going to have a lot of stuff to work with when you get back to your lab, though, correct? You're going to spend probably years looking at everything that you bring back.
Yeah, exactly. We will have jars of preserved specimens. We'll have a freezer full of mud for DNA sequencing. We will have new species that we'll have found and preserved, and we'll have to describe those species formally. So yes, we could literally spend a decade researching the samples that we're going to collect on this expedition.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. While you're here, check out some other videos you just may like.